you for the invitation to be with you today and with the East Tennessee Society of Professional Journalists group. I teach through the SPJ Code of Ethics in some of my classes, and I've always had a great feeling for the organization, and for many years was a member. The civil rights cold cases thing is really something that journalists on their own started back 25 years ago. There were particularly a journalist in Jackson, Mississippi, Jerry Mitchell, with the Jackson Clarion Ledger, which, since this is a journalism group and people understand what we're talking about, I'll tell you that when I wrote a book about the news coverage of the civil rights movement in the South, the Jackson Clarion Ledger came off as the absolute worst, most racist newspaper in the South. And over the years, it evolved and it changed. And they're willing to hire Jerry Mitchell, who was a cold case investigator. And he's bringing forth all these, forcing new trials on Medgar Evers' assassination and on the Birmingham, that was the nickname, Birmingham church bombings case, and several others. And slowly records start coming out through the very, painfully slow Freedom of Information Act, and journalists are starting to mimic what Jerry is doing with cases in their small towns. I joined efforts with Jerry and with a reporter and editor over in Faraday, Louisiana, one in Boston and one in Toronto and one in Alabama. And we just started looking into a lot of civil rights cold cases in the South with some funding that was gathered by the Center for Investigative Reporting. Now it's the Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting out in the Bay Area. And we're just bringing these cases into whatever medium we were in, newspaper, radio, television, whatever it was in, that we had some way of getting a foothold in there. And so that's when I was applying I had been a newspaper reporter for 35, 36 years, a reporter and editor in Mississippi at the Boston Globe, at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was based in the Midwest for 4 years for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And then my last job was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as managing editor. And, when I left that newspaper and wanted to go into another career, I went to Emory University and was fortunate that they hired me to what was then an endowed chair in journalism. And part of my pitch for the job was that I wanted to start a course in civil rights cold cases and teaching students how to examine history in an all new and different sort of way, and teach them research methods. And that's what we've been doing since 2011. And it's the fact is, I do have to say that it's in almost every one of these cases, there are no living perpetrators. That's just not going to be, we can't expect that that's going to be the goal, like it was with Jerry Mitchell and some of these guys 25 years ago or 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. So we're not going to bring justice in the courtroom, but we do believe we can bring the judgment of history, and that whoever got away with murder back in the 40s and the 50s and 60s because they were not prosecuted should not get away with murder in the history books and in the media of today. And so that sort of becomes a pretty sharp motivation. The last thing I'll say is that it is the plan of this course that I teach at Emory, the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project class, was to look only at cases that fell in the modern civil rights era. So end of World War II, 1945 to 1968, it's King assassination, maybe 1970. And that's what we've been doing. And that was, to your point, what you were bringing up, Gwen, was that's what we've done so far. And I can later show you all some samples of the work we've done. when the Ahmaud Arbery case happened, and the first time I heard about it and saw the video, I've still got it. I dashed off an email to the people I worked with at WABE. I'm not an employee over there. These are just people I'm lucky to be able to work with, and said, this case, everything I've been able to figure out so far, this case is so resembles the cases we've been doing from 1948 and 1962 and 1958 that the arc of history is undeniable, and the history hasn't changed on some of these cases. And we need to jump on the Arbery case. And that's why we did something that was out of that time frame.
And just going back to the word truth, because as journalists, that's what we do. We are truth seekers. What were some of the truths that were revealed? Just going to what your point of just how this is a modern day case, if you will, in correlation to what we've seen during the civil rights era. But what were some of those truths that really align with the point of how far we haven't come?
On the Arbery case?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Oh, gosh, yeah, it's a good question. Some of the truths were just the good old boy network, you know, that always sort of sided with the white people and disregarded the black people, and had no, I mean, I don't want to speak, it sounds like I'm speaking in absolutes. I know better than that as a journalist, you know, and I can qualify it and keep saying some and many and most or whatever, but I would hope that people who come to this, because we're journalists, will understand that I and accept my apology for sometimes speaking in language that's too sweeping. But even just the way that the first DA in Brunswick, and then the second DA who she tried to hand it off to, the case off to, because she thought she might have a conflict of interest because one of the defendants, Greg McMichael, had worked for her. And so she hands it off to another DA nearby, disregarding the fact that she knows that the other DA's son works for her. Okay. And then she, and the second DA tries to deep six the case. You know, he tries to make sure nothing proceeds with it. And in spite of clear evidence, you know, here's another thing that I'd say resonates from the past. And I can show you this a little bit later in just a document, but when Ahmaud Arbery is dead on the ground, and George Barnhill, the second DA, is sort of ruminating about this. He's on the scene, he's talking to the police, and he decides to order toxicology reports, okay? Not on the three men who chased Ahmaud Arbery, but on the dead man, Ahmaud Arbery. He says, yeah, from what I'm hearing, he was acting kind of funny, okay? And so decides, you know, if that's not a predisposition to believe in Black criminality, that it was the Black man who was up to no good, you know, as opposed to these three white men who were hysterically pursuing a Black jogger. I don't know what is, okay? And that struck me as something that you would have seen in the past. There is the idea that they would be the self-defense alibi. You'll see in case after case after case in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, white people knew that if they killed a Black person, the number one thing they had to do was, and the first thing they had to utter the magic words self-defense. That was their ticket out of jail, okay? And that became easy for their attorneys who were white to persuade juries who were all white back in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s, that the white police officer acted purely, you know, appropriately, and that sometimes that's what you have to do when you're up against a Black person who clearly is acting criminally. we had another case where, a black man is killed by two white cops in 1962. And it's sort of, and you can even talk to today's sheriff down there, who's a white man and who supported our whole thesis on what happened in that case. He says, it's just the way people think that, well, I don't know if that black man who we just shot actually did steal the gun, but what's he doing out at 10 o'clock at night? That kind of mentality. And so we probed that. The other thing that was interesting with that case, and again, I can show you something in a little bit, but the black men, the white police officer said they fired at this young 17-year-old kid, AC Hall, because a woman's gun had been stolen, and they thought that as he was running from, the police officers come up on the black kid. The white woman is in the back of the car. She says, that's him there, seemingly identifying the man she had seen, 45 minutes ago, stealing a gun. And the police get out of their car, and AC Hall starts running, and they start firing their guns. One of them says, I was firing just as fast as I could. I didn't even know what I was shooting at. Okay, something like that. And they said later, oh, well, it looked like it was very much what you saw in the Laquan McDonald story in Chicago. They said it looked like as he was running, he was turning around, and it looked like he had a gun in his hand. Okay. Well, then that's the narrative, always the narrative that a white cop was going to invoke. Okay. And it was going to work until they got to the coroner's inquest and the medical examiner showed up. And he presents his autopsy, and he was very uncomfortable having to reveal the results of his autopsy. He's a white guy, he's part of the structure. But he ultimately has to do it, and he does. And he says, this kid, AC Hall, was shot dead on in the back. Okay. And that's what killed him. He wasn't turned, he wasn't doing any of this, and still they were claiming self-defense. And they ultimately, even though the coroner's inquest decided, the 5 jurors decided that this was murder by the police. And by the way, these are all white men, the coroner's jurors. So, and 4 of them had been born in the 1890s. Okay, this is in 1962. It then goes to the grand jury, and the grand jury decided otherwise. Said, no, we think it was self-defense. Okay. Interesting, since East Tennessee is so close to Georgia, what I was astonished to learn, a discovery, and it was not our discovery, it was a discovery of a reporter here at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Brad Schrade. He looked at, forgive me if I'm not exactly right on the number, I'm thinking 160 police killings over a limited period of time in Georgia, but a pretty good span of time. And most of those were of black men, okay? And every single case, every one, there was no prosecution. There was no indictment. And I'm going to qualify that very quickly and say it turned out that there was one indictment. And the next day, it was withdrawn, okay? So you wonder, how is it that in every single case, the police acted appropriately? Well, here's why. Georgia law allowed police officers. Now, let me just back up and say, all of us have covered grand juries at various stages. We know that defendants don't go inside the grand jury. It depends state by state. The laws are different, but generally they don't go into grand juries. It's the prosecutor's show. He's not going to bring in anybody who's going to contradict the case he's trying to build. The trial will come up later and the defendant will have a chance to make their case. But in Georgia, the police officers were allowed in the coroner's inquest and in the grand jury, got to hear all the testimony against them, and then they got the last word. They got to speak last. And guess what? They got to speak last without being sworn in. So they weren't committed to tell the truth, and without being cross-examined. And there you have a sense, oh, that's why white police officers were never went to trial. The grand juries wouldn't bring them to trial. And that's what we had in the A.C. Hall case in 1962 in Macon, except the police officers, when they spoke, they contradicted each other. Their stories were so cockamamie, and including the cop who said, I saw he was running. I just firing my gun as fast as I could. Okay. And even those white coroner's jurors, 4 of them born in the 1890s, thought this is ridiculous. And their final decision, it's not a criminal case. I mean, there's not yet a criminal case. It's an adjudication of, or an examination of the nature and circumstances of the killing. Okay, that's what the coroner's inquest, the cause of death, things like that. But they went out of their way to say, in our opinion, this was murder. Okay, they were accusing the white cops of murdering the white kid, or the black kid, and then it goes to a grand jury. And by then, the police officers have an opportunity to straighten out their stories, okay, and to not contradict each other and to not say ridiculous things like I didn't even know what I was shooting at, And that was when the grand jury decided, in fact, that it was self-defense. I shouldn't say in fact. The grand jury decided it was self-defense. So those are among the discoveries that you see along the way. I mean, my students make other discoveries, which I'd like to show you in a few minutes. Is a family of Isaiah Nixon that lost his gravesite from 1948 when he was killed, and they buried him. And they went to the cemetery and the funeral. They buried him from 1948 to 2015. 47 years, my math. 67 years, his gravesite was lost because the family fled after he was killed and after he was buried. And over time, they would come back and they could never find his gravesite. And it turned out that the slab of cement over him had sunk into the earth, and grass had grown over it and weeds and everything. And there was never anything on the headstone. And it was lost for 67 years until a student of mine found it. So yeah, we've made some discoveries, but it's not going to bring criminal, reparations. I mean, there's not going to be a new trial. Everyone who did this is dead. So,
but I wonder then, will it at the very least set a tone for moving forward? How to identify what's wrong, what's right, what questions need to be asked that could provoke change?
I would certainly hope so. I'd go, but I can be even more specific about what it led to. After my student found the gravesite, and we're calling Dorothy from the cemetery, we're the daughter of Isaiah Nixon. And she knew we were going. I would always tell her if I was doing something like that. And she came up soon after that. Well, within a couple of months. It was the dead of winter, and she and her daughter, she needed her daughter to help her drive up. So they came up like 2 months later, and she sees her father's gravesite for the first time. It's very emotional. Okay. And that weekend, I raced home and tried to update my website with all this stuff, and did a little video and called up my daughter who knew how to do some film things. And she helped me put a Vimeo on the website showing Dorothy kneeling down and touching her father's name and then speaking. And it was very powerful what she had to say. Okay. And my daughter calls me up a couple of days later after I'm airing this on the website. And she says, Dad, I got an email through Vimeo from a man who says he's the nephew of the men who shot and killed Isaiah Nixon. And I said, really? And there's this pause, and she says, Dad, I think you've got me in too deep now. So I turned that name over to my students because this is what they're supposed to do. And they called him, and it was a man who was indeed the nephew of the men who killed Isaiah Nixon. And he's reaching out because he wants to apologize to the family. And we set it up, went down to, he happened to be living in the same, it's like of all the lousy gin joints in the world, you got to, it's that moment, but they lived in the same town, which made me even more suspicious of him at first. But so we went down there, it was Jacksonville, and met with him first, because Dorothy wasn't sure, the daughter, that she wanted to meet him. But she says, I'll trust Ellie's judgment, the student who found the gravesite, and yours, Hank. And I said, so we met with him, and we came back and we said, he's genuine. He's for real, And she says, okay. And so he had taken off that day. He's a teacher. He's a fourth grade teacher, special math specialist. I think it's math. And he, I called him up and said, she'll see you. Well, let's get together right after lunch. And he shows up, and it was a lovely session in which he apologizes, and she accepts it.
But doesn't that just speak to the responsibility that we have of just telling those stories and finding out what happened or what could happen? I know from a standpoint of a day-to-day journalist, when you have that deadline every single day, sometimes we get frustrated when we don't have those hard facts or those answers that people or the family wants. But at the very least, just allowing them to say, we want answers. We want something so that we can sleep at night. That's justice within itself. Is that something that you all have concluded in this?
Yeah, I think the attention, yes, is good, and reminder that when we think of terrorism, that it was among us. It was in our midst for many years, and that people are still suffering from it. There's still a hole in the heart of families. I pointed out recently, or said recently, that's right, it was in the Senate committee confirmation here, in my opening statement, said, when you kill Isaiah Nixon or James Brazier, any of these people, you're doing more than killing a human being, which is bad enough. You're killing a family's history. A lot of people are going to take with them the whole web of the family's history and never be there to pass it on to their children and their children's children. I mean, I am so grateful that my mother was alive and that I could interview her about my grandmother. Okay, for high school paper or something like that, what it was like to be in, Eastern Europe at that time. And I, but some families, it breaks them up, okay? It makes it very difficult for them to go forward. We have a case we're working on for the next season of the podcast, where one man is driving through town. Police stop him because they were always harassing him or his son because they drove late model cars, okay? And they stopped the older man, who would have been in his, I'm guessing, 60s. And his son comes along driving, they're all coming back from church, and sees that his father's been stopped by the police. And they're really harassing his father and beating him and hitting him over with a slapjack across his skull. And the son gets out and says, what are you doing? Let me help. I'll help you. Dad, don't resist. I'm going to help you get him in the car, he says to the police. But his opening line was, don't hit my daddy no more. I'm going to help you get him in the car. But that imperative, of course, led the police to say, you go home. I'm going to take your daddy to jail. You go home, and we're going to come by and get you. And we'll be there. And sure enough, they come by to get him, right? And they're arresting him. The father's in jail. They're arresting the son and beating him up on the lawn. Neighbors are all seeing it. There are affidavits on it. And while they're doing that, The son's own son, 10 years old, 9 or 10, comes running out of the house screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, what are they doing? What are they doing?" And grabs his daddy's leg. And one of the police officers knocks the kid down. 3 generations in one afternoon.
And I don't
And
think, oh, go ahead.
well, just the last thing, which is the younger son, according to his sisters, never spent a day of his life after that not angry and a difficult person after that. So, it's more than just taking a life, although again, that's bad enough. It's the ripple effect of that caused.
And let's just call it what it is. It's trauma.
It is trauma.
It's generational trauma. And we see that going back all these years later, people ask, well, things are different now. Things have changed now. But people fail to realize that within my household, things have not changed. The thought process has not changed. The distrust has not dissolved. Within my realm of which I grew up. And I think that people forget that that's real life and that's what happens.
Sure. Yeah.
I am super excited to allow you an opportunity, because I know we don't have you that long, to go ahead and show us some of the images that you have reflecting the stories that you mentioned, if you want to do that, because it looks like we might have some questions for you, and we do want to render some time for that.
All right, let me click through some PowerPoint slides, and I'm going to cut back the ones in which I use audio or video, but I think there's some from the 3 seasons: Isaiah Nixon, A.C. Hall, and then I'm going to end with Ahmaud Arbery. Okay. And so I am going to share the screen. I am going to optimize. Good. And somebody will, I hope, will say to me, speak up and tell me that if they can hear what I'm doing. Okay. Can you see the cover page of a PowerPoint? Thank you.
Yes.
Good. I'm gonna, all right. Okay. This is the Cold Cases Project website at Emory. I'm sorry to say it. I'm way behind on it. I don't even think that I have very much about the podcast on it, but I've done the best I can. I'm sort of a one-man show on this thing, but and these are the 3 of the 4 major cases we've looked at. This is Isaiah Nixon, I mentioned, who was killed in 1948. This man, the head of the NAACP down in Montgomery County, Georgia, Alston, was badly beaten that very same day. Dover Carter was his name, and I'm going to come back to him in a minute. 1948 was the second time in Georgia that Blacks could vote in the Democratic Party primary. Okay. There's a whole history there, which is interesting, but I'm not going to go into it. This is the Pittsburgh Courier, which was, incredibly important. Black newspaper out of Pittsburgh that came in throughout the South. I did a whole riff on it in my book, The Race Beat, because it was incredibly important as the glue of life for many Blacks in rural America who could just go into the mom and pop store and find out what's going on in the world. But also, they ended up raising a lot of money for the Nixon family after Isaiah Nixon was killed. This is the family after Isaiah Nixon is killed, and they're down in Alston, Georgia. This is Dorothy, who ended up being a major voice on the podcast and a major source for us about the events. This is her mother, and this is her grandmother. Okay, this is young Isaiah Jr., 13 days old when his daddy was killed. This is our research. I say it involves very dangerous work because if you notice the ladder, it's not fully open. And I'm yelling, Lucy, get down. I can't have you dying on the floor of a county courthouse in Georgia, but she didn't get down. She kept going on up there. She was the water polo player, so she knew it, thought she was Spider Woman. And up there, she found the indictment of the men who killed Isaiah Nixon, and they did go to trial, but it was 15 minutes and it was over, and they were acquitted. So the cemetery, I don't have time to show it all, but from a distance, this cemetery, all you saw was this headstone off on the perimeter of a small cemetery, black cemetery in a clearing in the woods in southeast Georgia, okay? You could not see any of this. You can see how this is raised here. This is bunched up. This was weeds. It was grass, and it had gotten that way from, probably within a couple of years after he was buried. And so when the family finally felt it was safe to come back and look for his gravesite, they couldn't find it because no one could see this. And my student, Ellie Studdard, is standing right here looking down at it. And there was a small opening here, like, the rain had pounded it or something. And she saw an I, and she saw an S, and she knew his name was Isaiah. And she starts digging over here. She says S-E-P, and she knew he died September 10th, 1948. She yells, "I found it." And we all ran over, and sure enough, that's exactly what she had done. She had found Isaiah Nixon's gravesite. And we, like I told you, we called her his wife. You can see his name was inscribed by the undertaker, either with a finger in wet cement or a stick. This is Dorothy coming and seeing it 67 years later, okay? The young girl I showed you in the picture. We did the podcast based on this. The first one, WABE came to me, the radio, the NPR station in Atlanta came to me and said, "We'd like to do a podcast." I said, okay. This is the son of Dover Carter, the head of the NAACP, who was beaten so badly. And on that day after he was beaten, within days of his being beaten, he took his wife and his 10 children and got on a train in Atlanta, the Silver Meteor, Silver Comet, Silver Meteor, and took it all the way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And that's where their family still is. But he always wanted to be buried back here, okay, in Georgia. So I'm going to play you a little quick excerpt from the podcast in which Aaron Carter, now at this point in his 70s, is discussing his father and recalling the day that his father was escorting Blacks to the polls to vote in defiance of authority, including with his wife, helping Blacks vote and being, trying to be denied the right, and they were beat up for that. Badly beat up. Now, thumbs up if you hear it.
A few minutes later, we arrive at Live Oak Baptist Church in Mount Vernon, Georgia. It's a sweet country church with a small cemetery behind it. And as we walk to the gravesite of his parents, Dover and Bessie Carter, a chorus of crickets and cicadas greet us. Now, Dover Carter may have fled Alston in fear, but Aaron says his dad always wanted to be buried back in Georgia.
He always wanted to be here. He's where he wanted to be.
Dover Carter lived to age 81, almost 40 years after that fateful election day. And his wife, Bessie, well, looking at her headstone, I was able to do some fast arithmetic, and I smiled. She was born in the year 1910. And she died in 2009. My goodness, she lived 99 years. But wait, this gets better. I need to tell you that in the time I've spent with the families of Isaiah Nixon and John Harris and Dover Carter, I've noticed many strong and similar threads. They believe deeply in God. Education is the ticket to a worthy and worthwhile life. And nothing should ever keep them from voting on Election Day. It's remarkable to learn that Bessie Carter lived long enough to cast her ballot for a black man for president, Barack Obama.
Oh, I think it was one of the proudest minutes of her life. I can imagine now that, looking back, when she wasn't allowed even to vote. And then now she's voting for a black man. It was the crowning part, I think, of her life.
Barack Obama was inaugurated on January 20th, 2009. Bessie Carter would die 5 days later. A few minutes.
So I hate to cut that, but I need to move this one.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Chilling.
Yeah.
Chilling.
So this is the AC Hall that I was talking about, the 17-year-old kid who was shot by the police officers based on a woman's mistaken identification of him, okay? She just had the wrong guy. He had met a girlfriend here on Cotton Avenue in Macon, and I won't play you the music, but the opener here, it's really great because it's got a lot of music. I mean, this is the summer that his neighbor, Otis Redding, released his first big hit, These Arms of Mine. It's James Brown he wasn't from there. He was from Augusta, but he had, or he lived there, I guess. I think that's what. But he had recorded his first hit on a Macon black radio station, and Little Richard came out of there. It's just a whole big music scene that was bubbling up around where AC Hall lived. And a good friend of his was our guide through this whole history. He had been a friend of AC Hall's, and he himself had gone into music. He's now in the Georgia Music Hall of Fame, Newton Collier, because he traveled the world with that great soul group, Sam and Dave, playing the horns, okay? Let me just go. I can't do that. All right. So on the 56th anniversary of that night where AC Hall was killed by the police, we go down there and we're going to reenact the steps that he and his girlfriend took, first in the daylight and then at night, okay? And then we produced a second buried truth out of it. Let me see, maybe I thought this had a sound to it, but maybe not. I did interview the woman who identified him. It took us 4 years to get her to talk, and she did. But she didn't, all she said she didn't want to go through it again. She didn't want to talk about it. It was just too painful. I think we just have to forget about it. And I said, well, mate, you can try to forget about it, but the family hasn't been able to, so.
No, that's not a good idea. Like I said, our health is not good, and I'm just not up to something like that. So neither one of us is interested. We would rather just let it stay back in the 60s where it was, but.
Let it stay back in the 60s. I actually hear that a lot as I research these civil rights cases. Sometimes it's phrased as, hey, that was a long time ago. Why can't we let bygones be bygones? At this point, I'm feeling I've got one more question I can ask before she cuts this off.
Yes, it was.
It had to shake you up a lot, and I know one question my students are asking is, when that happened and when you said that's him, did you have any idea that the police would just start shooting,
Heavens no. Why would I? I mean, I had no idea whatsoever. So, but like I said, that was a long time ago, and I'd just rather not discuss it, so.
As this conversation comes to an end, she added this.
I don't want to talk about it because, honestly, I don't want to talk about it. I don't think I should have to. It's been closed out and settled, and I don't see the point of bringing it up again.
Right. Okay.
I have to tell you, there's a part of me that really does want to let this thing go, to just leave it right there. But then I think about A.C. Hall's mother, Curly Hall, and his grandmother, who died broken-hearted, and his girlfriend, Eloise Franklin, who lost her first love. For them, and for A.C. Hall's childhood friends, people like Newt Collier, who A.C. could out-dunk, and Vivian Butts, who always felt A.C. was looking out for her, and for the church members, like Pauline Thomas, who found A.C. to be a respectful, sweet kid, and for Hall's attorney, Howard Moore, Jr., who never knew A.C., but was brilliant in giving A.C. a presence in the courtroom. for all of them. This was never closed out and settled. They were never able to let it go. So not to be mean or hurtful to Doris Hopper, but I'm thinking she needs to know this.
Well, from your, that's fine. From your perspective, it's closed out. From the family and the friends of AC Hall, it's not over. That's
Okay.
the only thing I would say.
That's
There's still,
fine. That's up to them, but from my point of view, mine's done with it.
I want to play one more there, or maybe two. Here's
My dad was a
Hold
fine,
on.
upstanding man. He was turned
let me stop that.
chewed or something, and that's when they fired.
No, hold on. I just want to move this because I can't. Oh, can I put this? I can move this over here, can't I? Good.
And,
All
and
right.
Hank,
So I
This was
think-
the son of one of the cops who killed him. Okay. And he has been living with the myth all these years that AC Hall pulled a gun. This is what happens when that narrative comes up as the self-defense alibi, right? And all these years later, it doesn't matter that it's been debunked by the medical examiner, okay, from 1962 to a couple of years ago when I interviewed the son. But maybe this will help to hear this. And
Of his life to support.
oh, guys, I apologize. Here we go.
Now, we've talked.
No, one more. I apologize for my, there we go.
My dad was a fine, upstanding man, a good, honest man, and he worked every day of his life to support, his family. And I know what kind of man he was, and I just don't believe he done anything wrong. I talked with him later in life after I grew up, and I think what he done in the line of duty. I don't think he done anything underhanded. He was protecting his life is what he was doing.
As that last statement suggests, the story that Kenny Durden got from his father is roughly the same story you've been hearing from the police and the Hoppers, with a few important differences. In Kenny Durden's version, AC Hall had a gun, and the shooting took place while officers Durden and Brown were chasing AC on foot.
The lady that the gun was stolen from, she identified the guy, and when he ran, they got in a foot pursuit with him, and that's when my dad said that he pulled the gun out, and that's when he was shot.
Right.
I really believe what he told me to be the truth, and nobody will ever make me believe otherwise, and I don't think I'm being biased just because he was my dad.
right.
I just know him.
But now, there was something I needed to tell Kenny Durden, something he didn't know, and it concerned that report from the medical examiner.
Was when the medical examiner came in with his report, and it showed that the young man had been shot right in the back.
Then Kenny Durden repeated the version that he'd long believed to be true, the version in which AC Hall precipitated the shooting. But Durden seemed to be searching for something that could explain how AC came to be shot in the back.
Well, my dad said that he was running and that he reached in his back pocket like he was reaching for a gun or like he was turning to shoot or something. And that's when they fired, so I don't know.
Let's not gloss over that last remark, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to make too much of this. After all, this is probably the first time Kenny Durden's ever heard a version that countered his dad's account. But he's clearly thinking about this alternative version. And then he says something that makes me wonder if he's wrestling, even struggling with this new information.
If the young man lost his life any other way than that, I'm terribly sorry. I mean, I'm sorry the young man died anyway.
That was an incredible moment when he says, huh. I mean, it just like exploded in my ears when I went back and listened. Okay. One more. Well, I'm not going to do this, but he goes on to say his father did have a stigma about Black people. Okay. He had Black friends. He said, gives me all that. He says, but I'll tell you, he did have a stigma about Black people.
Hank, this is Maria, just cutting in real quick. This is very powerful stuff, and you are welcome to go past 1 o'clock if there's anything else you want to play before we
I want to give people
Ahmaud
a
Arbery.
chance to talk. Yeah, I'm going to cut. I think we're coming right up on Arbery. Thank you. I appreciate it. It does sometimes take me longer
Now
than I expect. This is my students, okay?
Aaron Akindo had a take that I found so uplifting. We'd been focusing for weeks on the tragic death of A.C. Hall, and we'd really come to like this young man. We'd focused on the horrible circumstances that led to his death. This was some really depressing stuff. Some of us were moved to tears as we walked the night before to Ash and First Streets, where he died, and then in the morning as we stood over his gravesite. How, I wondered, do we go forward from here? How do we clear our eyes and see a path forward? As usual, a student showed the way. I'm going to let student Aaron Akindo deliver the benediction for this season of Buried Truths.
Part of me felt weird at first last night when I was at the site of his death on First Street and Ash, because I felt like I'm here because he died. But now being at the gravesite, it's like I'm here because he lived. Yeah, I'm here because he lived, and that is something that I feel like it does him a little bit of justice.
This is Buried Truths. I'm Hank Klibanoff. Aaron Akindo.
So Ahmaud Arbery, the most recent story, February 2020. Most people, I'm sure, know the story. He's jogging through a neighborhood, okay? I'm not going to play too much, but this is just a diagram where, he's jogging around here. And one set of the white guys is coming at him this way. Another set's going around here and closing him off. I mean, they had him trapped. If he could have gotten up here and gotten out, he'd have known where he was and gotten home. And the thing that these are my students. Like I said, I was working on another season 3 down in Albany, Georgia, and that area, and COVID broke out there in a big way. I couldn't stay, and I certainly couldn't take students. All these students all lost their either summer work, scholarships, internships, and were looking to get involved. And I went out and raised a little money and was able to, keep them going. Not a single one of them asked for a penny, and they did some amazing work. These are the 3 men, as you know. One thing we did that, not sure what, so far I haven't heard any criticism of it, but you could expect that I would. I wanted to know more about the history of the McMichaels and Mr. Bryan, the white people, as well as Ahmaud Arbery, okay? And it started with something I heard about Arbery, and then I'll come back to that in a second. But that this student over here, you can't really see her picture, Cameron Katz, she began looking through the McMichael line and couldn't find anything. In fact, Greg McMichael's father died when Greg McMichael was 14. It was on a construction accident, like out of state. So then he starts looking through his mother's side, and that's where it takes it all the way back into the Confederacy, and finds that Greg and Travis McMichael's ancestors fought for the Confederacy, which was not a crime, unless you want to consider that sedition. I mean, that's a whole nother intellectual argument, but as well as they owned slaves, not a whole lot, 5, I think it was. But that was some really great research that I thought. And I did point out that I don't believe racism is inherited. I don't think it's a genetic pass through. And yet at the same time, I find this interesting, and I'll just leave it at that for right now. We also looked at Bilali Muhammad. Now here is, I'm going to play, I think this will be the last tape, the last thing. There's a guy down in St. Simons, Jim Barger, and he knew the family of Ahmaud Arbery. He had gone to the University of Mississippi Center for the Study of Southern Culture, got his master's degree there, and he'd come back to live in St. Simons. He just loved the atmosphere, the culture. He loved Sapelo Island. He loved the stories of the Geechee and the Gullah influences. And he discovered that Ahmaud Arbery, or maybe, and I don't even know if the Arbery family really knew this, went all the way back to a guy named Bilali Muhammad, a literate Muslim who came from West Africa to Sapelo Island, and he became the most prominent of the enslaved there. He was a brilliant agronomist. He knew so much about growing and about agriculture, and his slave owner, Thomas Spalding, member of the U.S. House of Representatives, this, that, the other, gave him a lot of latitude to do whatever he could to make as much money as he could for the farm, which involved some very creative, inventive processes of growing. He trusted Bilali Muhammad. He armed him and gave him the weaponry they would need to defend themselves, the enslaved, against insurrection during which war? I forget which war. And so this is,
I always felt
this
like
is
St.
all
Simons and the
a
Golden
part
Hour
of
belonged.
talking about if you look at the way the McMichaels and Roddy Bryan went after Ahmaud Arbery, you get the impression they think he's an intruder, he's an interloper. What's he doing coming in here? You know, would they have done that for a white man? Well, now they both, or at least one has admitted he would not have. That was Travis the other day. But Jim Barger's point is that, well, you'll listen, and it just turns it on its head. Sorry, guys, I apologize.
Yeah.
Nope, I'm sorry. Here we go.
I always felt like St. Simons and the Golden Owls belonged to the Geechees. And so this idea that a descendant of the Geechees couldn't run wherever he wanted to run is such a misinterpretation of place. They killed him because they thought he didn't belong there. I've studied enough and encountered enough personally and lived here long enough to know that nobody belonged here more than he did. You can't understand or fully appreciate the Golden Isles unless you understand the heritage of the Black people who have lived here since the 1600s.
By the way, Bilali Muhammad left behind, when after he died, they found a 13-page manuscript that he had written in Arabic that is now in the Hargret Rare Books Library at UGA. It has significant historical value. I'm not going to be able to play you this. I'm very proud that we raised all the issues in the podcast that were brought up at the trial that led to the conviction, okay? This shows that even the police said it was criminal trespass, not burglary, that Ahmaud Arbery might have been doing, but and then we have Maud moments. If you're going to post this or something and people to look at later, I guess I don't mind that, but I would, then this is his former teammates all talking about him, and they liked him as just a good guy. So I think I'll rest my case at that point. And I'm sorry it did take so long, but I'll take questions as long as you have them.
No, that was absolutely fantastic. I mean, at some point I was speechless. I got chills. You almost got a tear out of me. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we can do some air claps, some virtual claps for you on that regard. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and turn to some of those questions. We got some great ones. And I do hope, Thomas, I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. These are a few questions from Thomas Fraser. He asked a really great question here. What kind of emotional load do you carry with this work?
Oh, that's a good question. I try not to take a measure of that. Okay. I mean, I was a journalist for 35, 36 years. You know, you cover all sorts of things that can rip your heart apart. And yet what you do know is you have a deadline, you got to move along and you got to get it out. And the worst yet, at the same time, the worst thing you can do is rush someone to share their story. When, you know, it's important to know that people don't want to lose control of their story. They don't want to just turn it over to somebody else they don't know, someone else they don't have reason to trust. And so it's less an emotional load, I guess, than trying to work through the strategy, okay, of persuading them that this can have a benefit, okay. But even I know that sometimes it doesn't, you know. I mean, I teach an ethics course where what sometimes a picture that you take of a mother hysterical after a child has died sometimes can create, you know, a terrific GoFundMe case that suddenly is going to pay for her other child's college education or something like that, and sometimes can lead that mother just to just be filled with hatred for the photographer for what they did, you know, and to want to sue them and all this for their invasion of privacy. So you never really know exactly how it's going to go. I am who I am. I approach it as I, you know, and not everyone's always willing on the victim side is always willing to help, and it can take a long time.
Thank you for that. Thomas is rolling out with some very great questions. Another one he has here. I lived in and have family in South Georgia during the post-trial coverage. Many people describe the convictions as historic. How so? How would you describe this as a historical conviction?
Well, right. First of all, this was one juror away from the kinds of juries I was telling you about existed in the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s when they were all white. This had 12 whites and 1 black. And they would not have been convicted without 12 whites, you know, without a majority white. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, and we talk about this, and I keep waiting to get critiqued on this, but right away, I mean, even though the local power structure down in Brunswick, the DA and the neighboring DA and other people are favoring the police, I mean, favoring the 3 men who shot and killed him and sort of saying there's no grounds for prosecuting them and so forth, you know. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and the attorney general, Chris Carr, swept in very quickly once the GBI took charge and had press conference. They declared this the most savage vigilante justice that they are attempted justice that they've seen, yada, yada, yada. You would not have seen that in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. By comparison, the first time that Byron de la Beckwith went on trial for shooting and killing Medgar Evers, guess who walked into the courtroom to shake his hand? Ross Barnett, governor of Mississippi. And I think he had just stepped down as governor, but you get the point. He was beloved as the white savior, you know, who was gonna, and so I'd say you never had a sense that the state was gonna come in and help, you know, when through all those many years that Eugene Cook was the attorney general of the state of Georgia. And I would love for a member of his family to hear this and call me and say, maybe I want to tell you something that you didn't know about him because he really was a good guy and this, that, and the other. I'm always game to hear it. You know, he was suing the NAACP for being a communist organization, you know, and he was trying to get their membership records. He was just doing all sorts of things. And he would save those kinds of speeches to deliver to the peace officers of Georgia annual meetings, okay? Not just Kiwanis Club or something like that, you know, but the people who could actually make life miserable for Black people. Those are a couple of examples of how things have changed.
Absolutely. And I'd say too, just the fact that we had all of the video from start to finish too.
Yes.
And even seeing how other people did the same thing that Ahmaud did, just walking into that
Right.
unfinished home.
By the way, I'm glad you said that, because even though what I'm about to tell you predates the Arbery case, it was revelation of that law that allowed police officers to go inside the coroner's inquest and grand jury and speak last without being sworn in and without being cross-examined. It was revelation of that in the disclosure of that in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that led the Georgia legislature, otherwise unprompted, to repeal that or to revise it. I think they still have some privilege, police do. I can't remember, but that was that was something in the past they would have just ignored. Right? Who cares what that lying Atlanta newspaper thinks?
Thank you for that. And Thomas has a last question here. What do you think is going through the heads of the felons convicted in the case? I thought I saw one other question. Did I skip a question?
It says, do you think there's reason to fear voter suppression efforts?
Oh, that's the one. Yes, that's the one. Okay. I'm sorry. Yes, if I kept going. So that was his second to last question here. So
I couldn't tell you what's going through the heads of felons. Sorry. Although, like I said, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, Travis McMichael walked into the courtroom the other day in federal court before the hate trial and said, yes, I acted with racial intent, and then the judge said, sorry, I'm not going to let you plead out on this one, and so there you've got his declaration hanging out there, and it can't serve him can't do him any good. But on the other one, do we fear there's voter suppression efforts? I don't think I do think it's something to fear and to believe is actually going on. I do.
Very timely. I know that we're going to be paying close attention to that as things develop with the back and forth and the tug of war on that.
Sure.
And then one last point you made, I just want to go back to, because it's going to eat me up if I don't bring it up, is that question or the narrative that we hear in these cases is self-defense, one. And then the one thing that is struggled to be answered is, what did he do? And that was one thing that we hear over and over again. Talk about history repeating itself.
Are you talking about the 911 operator?
Yes.
That to me, man. I've learned a lot about a new way to write by doing a podcast, and how to listen, to write for the ear. I never did that as a daily newspaper writer. I tried to write some, whatever that would appeal and engage people and all this stuff, whether it was a magazine piece or whatever, because we used to have Sunday magazines at the publications I worked for. But writing for the ear is different. And I've just listened to a 911 call, one of those 911 calls. And when that operator twice or three times had to say, just tell me.
What did he do?
What is he doing wrong? of Ahmaud Arbery, or what did he do wrong, or something, what? And I always thought that's an epitaph for him. What was he doing wrong? He's dead now. Let's go back over this now. What was he doing wrong? And that's why I'm so glad we had the trial, and I'm so glad we had the judge's remarks at the end of the trial. We did later, I think our last episode of the podcast was, we played the judge's entire remarks on the podcast, okay? Because they were pretty remarkable, I thought, his takeaway.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so very much. I do want to read just a comment because I think we can all agree here, from Catherine Luther. She's with UT, also a former the president of our board here. She says, thank you so much for this very informative session. Your students have been doing some wonderful work. I need to jump off for a meeting, so she's not with us, but we do thank you, Catherine, Thomas, and all others. Miss Dorothy, I see your name up there.
Yeah,
Let's
great
see if
questions,
you have
Tom.
any.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And Mr. John, I see you're here too. Thank you all. Man, this has been truly remarkable. If you all enjoyed what you heard in those excerpts on the PowerPoint, do yourself a favor by downloading and subscribing to the podcast that you can find on any platform where you listen and get your podcast. I mean, it's the real deal. I mean, you saw those visuals, but you get to picture those visuals. You mentioned writing for the ear, and that is exactly what you all do with the music, the storytelling, even the sounds of opening the doors. Everything is really well done.
Yeah, I've got a fantastic producer and team that come together only for I mean, they have a million other jobs at the NPR station. It's a small operation, but
well, you do in this business, right? You got to have
right.
one
That's
more
right.
job.
Exactly. Right. That's right.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much. Maria, did you want to close us out or formally close us out?
Yes, first, Gwendolyn, thank you so much. Fantastic job of moderating this discussion. Hank, thank you for your time. I want to see that entire PowerPoint. We may have to have you back at some point. I don't want to miss any of that. Again, this was part of our Black History Month programming, a very difficult topic, but definitely one that still needs to be discussed. We are a long way from racial reconciliation of any kind. Your presentation makes it clear that we have come a long way and we have so far to go. And it is important for journalists like yourself and Gwen and the other journalists listening to this now or later to tell these stories, tell these authentic stories, and do not let the truth be buried. Again, thank you so much for everyone coming today. And Hank, thank you so very much. I will stop the recording now. And those of you who want to just stay, if you want to stay and ask Hank anything else, you can. Otherwise, everybody I know needs to get back to work. Thank you so much.